100 years ago, in 1902, there was a whole continent in the world which, with two small exceptions, was completely owned by people from another continent. And in fact, that conquest had essentially taken place over the previous 30 to 40 years. It's one of the most amazing conquests in the history of humanity. The taking of Africa by Europe. That conquest resulted in the fact that 700 million people, that's the population that exists today and most likely is closer to 1 billion, in time came under the control of the European powers. Africa is essentially divided by a great physical and cultural divide. That divide is the Sahara Desert, which is in almost all of the north of Africa and which simply continues on into Saudi Arabia and on into the Gobi Desert and whatever. North of the Sahara is the Mediterranean coastline. That is part of the Arab world. And actually, its history is tied to the history of the Mediterranean world. But south of the Sahara lies what we call Black Africa, stretching all the way from the Sahara to the tip of what is South Africa, and that is what was so rapidly conquered in only a few years. It had been penetrated before by explorers. It had been exploited before by slave traders, but it had not been formally conquered. It was taken over, and in fact, the conquerors did not meet in Africa even. The insult was they met in Berlin, and then they drew all the boundaries. All the boundaries of modern African states were not drawn by Africans. They were drawn by Europeans. Somebody had a map in Berlin. Bismarck was there, and they simply drew the boundaries. They were totally ignorant of what we call cultural boundaries. They were aware of physical boundaries. They knew where rivers were and mountains to some degree were. And in fact, the boundaries followed physical boundaries. But the boundaries often simply crossed right through tribal territories, right through nations. But the people in Europe didn't understand and didn't care. They were into the age of imperialism, the age of proving that indeed the Europeans were the greatest of all possible people. They were going to dominate Africa and then find out what was there. So they drew all these state boundaries. And along the way, they began to bring white people, European people, to Africa. In certain parts of Africa, only a few came. In the area where the rainforests were, in the central part of Africa, it was a climate that European people did not find comfortable. And so very few came to settle there. In other parts, like in the highlands of Kenya, well, near Nairobi, where the climate in the highlands is very much like the climate that you would find in southern Europe, then lots and lots of whites came. Or if we go down to Zimbabwe, formerly called Rhodesia, in the highlands there, many, many people went because the climate corresponded in some way to what they had experienced as Europeans. So white people came, and of course, the big issue at the end of the 19th century, because the world had now arrived at an intellectual place in the West where they had to justify their conquest by something other than God told us to. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Europeans conquered North and South America, the justification they used was that the natives needed to be converted, saved, otherwise they would not be saved. But by the end of the 19th century, in a more secular age, that argument was no longer valid. That is, the audience in Europe would not accept it. So another reason was given, and the reason that was given is the reason given by Rudyard Kipling. The reason was that these people live in a savage culture, and therefore they must be rescued from that savage culture. They must be civilized and brought into what we would call the modern world, and by the modern world was meant by Europeans, the European world and European civilization. So the British came, they took the biggest slice. The French came, they took the second biggest slice. The third were the Portuguese, and then down the line were the Spanish and the Italians. But then there was one very small country in Europe that took a huge, big slice, what today we call the Congo. It was called Zaire for many years. Now it's back to being called the Congo, and that was the little country of Belgium. Now, when the Europeans came to Africa at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century to carve it all up, what did they get? Well, they found, we're talking about black Africa, we're not talking about the strip along the Mediterranean, right? They found three races of people, one that was overwhelmingly dominant. That race is sometimes called Negro, sometimes black, sometimes Bantu, sometimes African. It originated here in West Africa, north of the rainforests, in the prairie, in the grassland, and ultimately moved eastward and then southward and southward and occupied almost all the territory of what we would call black Africa. Second race were a people that we call today anthropologically the Nilotics. They originated here somewhere in the upper Nile, and they ultimately moved into what today is Ethiopia, and they moved down into what is Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania. And in fact, the two races clashed. The great massacre that occurred in 1994, 1995 in Rwanda is the result of a clash of those two races. And the third race is the race of the Bushmen. The Bushmen occupied most of southern Africa before the Negroes came. The Negroes came from here, came across, moved down, and they were squeezed, pushed farther south, and they remain only a small population. Now, the overwhelming majority of these people, when conquered by the Europeans, were in what we call the agricultural stage. They were either farmers or herdsmen. They either farmed grain or they farmed animals. Only the Bushmen were still in what we call the hunting stage. And the ones who herded were very much attached to an animal that you will often see. I mean, you'll see it all over Africa, certainly in eastern and southern Africa, among the Bantus, and that is the cow, cattle raising. Cattle was the money of the world. It was the symbol of your wealth. The number of cows you had was the symbol of your status. And if you wanted wives, you bought them with with cows. I mean, that's how the economy worked. The level of political organization was comparatively low. There were very few examples of what we would call established large territorial nations. Most of the people in black Africa in this agricultural world lived at a stage where they'd gone beyond family to clan, beyond clan to tribe, and in some cases tribes had federated into nations. What was characteristic of this culture, and very, very important, all cultures go through it. Even European culture went through it. That's why we have kings. That is, most clans and tribes, and whatever federated nations there were dominated by somebody called a chief. The chief was like the father of the clan, the father of the tribe, the father of the nation. His job was lifelong, and it was generally inherited. Now, the idea of inherited chiefdom is not foreign to the European world. We call it kings and we call it kings and queens, right? I mean, that thing. But it was an intrinsic part of African culture. What we call political democracy was not part of this culture. It had already emerged into the culture of the Europeans, but certainly it had not entered into black African culture, because in order to have political democracy, you have to have some vestiges of industrialization, capitalism, a money economy, urbanization. None of that basically existed in the parts of black Africa that were conquered. It was a culture which featured a very major coping strategy for dealing with an economy that was essentially on the survival level. The people of Africa were, and they remain, deeply, deeply religious. Their sense of the world of the spirit, of the spiritual world, or the world of the spirits, is very, very intense. No adequate name has been given to this religion. It varies. It features generally the worship and reverence for ancestors and for nature gods. The name that appears in Benin on the West African coast is the word voodoo, but it was not a primitive religion. It was a sophisticated religion with a clergy all its own and with an intense following, meaning people spent a lot of their time during the day being religious, a major coping strategy. And they had also created a notable art, which has now become a valuable part of many art collections, right? All over the world, including Detroit. Most of the art was related to religious ritual or the representation of the spirit world. And it featured not only working with wood, but also very, very sophisticated working with metals. It was a world in which there was incessant and continuous warfare. It was an economy of scarcity. And in fact, they were fighting with each other all the time. One of the consequences of warfare was an institution which existed in Africa before Europeans arrived. It's called slavery. People who were captured in war were turned into slaves. If they were not slaughtered, they were turned into slaves. They became the slaves of their captors. And that was part of the culture. In that respect, Africa did not differ from Asia or from Europe or from the cultures in North or South America. Now, when the Europeans arrived, by the 19th century, Europe was different from the 16th century when the Europeans conquered North and South America. When they arrived, there were great and powerful, strong nations in Europe. The Europeans were not united. The story of what happened in Africa might have been entirely different. They were divided up into competing nations. They had discovered both the power of capitalism and the power of science. And in fact, while Africa, which they conquered, was intensely religious, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, in Western and Central Europe, the populations were now becoming secularized. And that was evidenced by the turning to a kind of new school system, which most of us were raised in, which are called either state schools, public schools, secular schools, whatever it be, featuring at the center of it the social and the physical and the natural sciences. So that was part of their world. It was a world in which the overwhelming majority of the people had already been urbanized, and a new political form of government had come. By the end of the 19th century, many of the kings in Europe had been overthrown, and now you had parliamentary government, and you had ideas like the rights of individuals to speech, to assembly, the kinds of things that we take for granted, but which in terms of human history are comparatively new, and which have their early development in Europe. So the Europeans brought that. So when they arrived, they found a population which was in one condition, and they came in another condition. The other thing that was very important was that by the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, the Europeans had become overwhelmingly middle-classed. They had a large, educated middle class. And one of the reasons why democracy worked in places like England and Holland and Norway and Denmark and Sweden, and for a time even in France, and for part of German history, is because there was the presence of this large middle class, which was caught up in all the revolutions that had to do with urbanization and capitalism and the money economy and whatever else it be. Now, the coming of the Europeans, and we're talking about a very short period of time. The Berlin Congress was held in 1886. At that time, most of Africa was unoccupied. So over a period of maybe 60 or 70 years, the Europeans transformed the African environment. One of the things they created are cities. Almost all the cities in black Africa were created by Europeans. So if I go to the Congo, Kinshasa, the capital, well, that was Leopoldville, named after King Leopold. Stanleyville up here, that was named after, the famous Stanley, the explorer who found Livingston. Elizabethville, the Copper Territory, named after Queen Elizabeth in Belgium. If I do Cape Town or Johannesburg, if I do Salisbury, now called Harare in Zimbabwe, wherever we go, Lagos and all these cities were created by Europeans. And when they were built, they were designed essentially as European cities. They may have ended up with African slums, but they were designed as European cities. It was the Europeans who built railroads and roads. Not a lot, but they built them. And they built them in order to extract whatever wealth there was and to transport it to ports where they could be transported to Europe. They created administration. The chief system did not involve what we would call the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of, there was the chief, and if you had a problem, you what? You went to the chief, and he had a council, all right. But now you have a government, so you have a colony. The colony is the Gold Coast, now called Ghana. So now there is a British governor, and the British governor has a minister of the roads, and he has a what? A minister of the interior, and he has a minister of the police. Well, that wasn't something that African culture was accustomed to. This was part of what we call the new management development in the Western world. And then they built schools. Now, they did not build a lot of schools, but they built schools. And what is very interesting was that most of these schools were built not by the governments of Europe that conquered Africa. They were built by missionaries. There were Christian missionaries who now poured into Africa. That was fertile territory. And they now came into Africa to convert the natives. It's very interesting. By the 19th century, sending missionaries to Greenwich Village was most likely a waste of time. I mean, that is, Europeans had now become so secularized that, it wasn't going to work. So now, here was this whole area, do you understand? A very, very religious people, and in fact, the missionaries poured into the area. They often created the schools, and also something that didn't exist before, the beginnings of a health service, clinics, and hospitals. Did they build enough? Today, is the health service adequate? I mean, you're leaving the hospital before the operation. They kick you. No, they throw you out of the hospital. But I mean, they built the schools and they built the hospitals, and they also trained police. And the police were the beginning of what we call the native military, because the European powers did not have enough soldiers to send to Africa to occupy the territory, so they trained native people. They gave them jobs and they trained them in Western military style. They also created an elite, a group of intellectuals who were Westernized. They could be anywhere in the colonies. I mean, they could be in Nigeria, they could be in the Gold Coast, they could be in Tanzania, they could be in Kenya, wherever it was. These were bright students who often graduated from missionary schools, who were then sent off to England and France, where they were now exposed to what we call the cultures of Europe. They picked up even what we call the political ideas of Europe. In some cases, they were even radical socialism, which seemed to have no place in the African world, but they came back with it, all right? And now you have a small group of well-educated natives who have received a very, very adequate Western education. And one of the great transformations was all over black Africa, on the whole, Christianity has replaced the native religion. The overwhelming majority of black Africa south of the Sahara is Christian. Now, there is a line that runs through here. Just south of the Sahara, there's a place called the Sudan. Before the Christians had come, the Arabs had come south of the Sahara, and they had converted thousands and hundreds of thousands of people to Islam. So when the Europeans were arriving, Islam was already what? Moving down, and then the Christians came in and pretty much took the rest. Now, obviously, there are large pockets of what we call native religion. And in fact, when you do it that fast, you end up with a Christianity which is mixed. It's Christian, but then it has many, many native elements to it. But it's a major achievement. The major achievement of Christianity in modern times is the conversion of Africa. They tried it in Asia. It didn't work. They didn't get the Japanese, did they? And they really didn't get the Chinese. They got a lot of Koreans. That was one of the success stories. And they got a lot of Vietnamese. But on the whole, they failed. Did they get India? No. They're the great success story of Christianity, because this is an intensely religious environment. By the time Christian missionaries arrived in Japan, not only did they have a high sense of their own national culture, they were all ready for computers. They were not into what we call the world of intense religion. So this was a major transformation. Now, from the very beginning, the colonial powers had some serious problems. First of all, the states they carved up were composed of nations and tribes that hated each other. So the policing operation became very hard. So here you've got Rwanda. You see how small Rwanda is? Where you got Hutus and Tutsis. Hutus are Negro. Tutsis are Nilotic. Hate each other. So you have a what? You have a major policing problem. You've walked into this thing, and now you have to police it. One of the things, obviously, was racism. The whites who arrived, for whatever reason, thought of themselves as superior to the people they conquered. They created their own enclaves where they lived. And they viewed the local population as a source of servants and workers. And that was a problem in the sense that they weren't there to admit all these people into what we call the benighted circle. The third was the obvious dichotomy between the whites at the top and the power and wealth they possessed, and the poverty that continued to exist below, because no matter what the investment of Europe was, it could hardly touch the poverty. Now, poverty is relative. It's how you perceive things. Once you bring the consumer culture to Africa, the levels of expectation, right, at one time you thought you were well off, and now you know you're what? You're poor. One of the problems was the enormous resentment that was now generated among the conquered Africans who resented the racism and resented the dichotomy. One of the problems was westernization. So you bring the idea of individual rights. Well, individual rights works in an environment where you've got individuals. So it's an urban environment in which the family is changing. You stay with your parents for 18 years and then you what? You leave. You're on your own. But in Africa, it's a farm culture. Do you understand? You're part of what? You're part of your family. You're always part of your family. Your family is always part of that clan. That clan is always part of that what? Of that tribe. Do you turn to your chief and say, I don't care what you think. In order to do that, you would need a different kind of economy. I mean, you would need a different kind of environment. So what often happened was that Western ideas were brought. And people nodded their head. Yes, we believe in equality. Yes, we believe in individuality. But then I would like 5 wives. No. It's not to fault the culture, it's just what? I mean, it's very hard to do that. That often happens. People nod their heads and they say, I agree. And you say, oh, you think they agree. But integrating into your behavior, the nod is always the hard thing. One of the major problems was with the coming of Western medicine, even though there was poverty, some of the diseases, infectious diseases that had wiped out the population on a regular basis, now didn't do that anymore. So now the population is expanding, which only aggravates the problem of poverty. And then, of course, comes the big problem. Africa was conquered in what I would call the enthusiasm of imperialism, with the idea that most likely there were lots of valuable things in here. But after a while, people discovered that the cost of administration often outraced the profits from the exploitation. So you get some cocoa, cacao, and you get some tobacco and whatever else it is, and your profit depends on the world price for your product, whatever it be. But sometimes even getting the product out to a port involves such an investment in terms of infrastructure that people began to ask the question, is this worth investing in? If you look at the levels of investment of Europeans in the 20th century, Europeans were enthusiastic to invest in North America. Do you understand? Pretty good return. They were enthusiastic to invest in Australia. And they were often enthusiastic to invest in parts of Asia. But they weren't overwhelmingly enthusiastic to invest in Africa, and that was a problem in terms of developing the economy. Now, as we know, the European system collapsed between 1945, the end of the Second World War, and 1980. Almost every colony, European colony, found its independence. That is, the system collapsed, and it collapsed for a variety of reasons. One, the major controllers of Africa, although they were victors in the First and Second World War, were exhausted. Britain and France no longer had the power to hang on to Africa, and their empires declined. But the major reason has to do with something that occurred after the Second World War and involves America. After the Second World War, another war began, which is called the Cold War. And now the United States, with its allies, Britain and France, are against the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union felt that the control of Africa by the British and the French and the Italians was great for its propaganda, because now it would come in and what? Mobilize the masses against the governments. So the United States of America essentially intervened. America's policy was that we need to liberate the states in Africa so that they cannot be exploited by the Soviet Union. Meaning the Soviet Union won't be able to raise resistance movements because they will be independent. And in fact, the United States of America supported the removal of Britain and France and the Portuguese and all of that from the continent in order to counter the main enemy. The main enemy was the Soviet Union. Now, part of the collapse was due to the fact that people within these colonies rose up in rebellion, and in fact, the colonial powers did not have the will to resist them. Sometimes that rebellion featured terrorism. Terrorism is not new. You may remember from the late 50s and 60s, the Mau Maus in Kenya. Do you remember that? I mean, terrorism isn't something new. It was a tool certainly used by native populations and native rebels against the colonial powers in order to drive them out. And in the case of England, she no longer had the will or the way to offer any kind of sufficient resistance. 100 years before she would have, but not now. And the other thing was very simple. In almost all of Africa, there were too few white people to serve as a counterbalance. There was only one part of Africa where there were enough white people to serve as a counterbalance. They had come from Europe, and that was in South Africa and to some degree in what was called Rhodesia or Southern Rhodesia, what today is called Zimbabwe. There were enough white people to offer what I would call resistance. That is, you could use them as a resistance against the rebels. But in all other places, that wasn't true. In Kenya, there was a fairly large group, some 60,000, but it was of insufficient size and will to offer the resistance. So the system collapsed, and now all these states, the boundaries of which were defined by Europeans, become independent. And the moment they become independent, they're confronted with overwhelming challenges. The first is, you're now the president of Rwanda. You got the same problem that the Belgians had. You've got Hutus and Tutsis. And now you've got to what? Keep them at peace with each other. They hate each other. If you could only separate them and put them into two separate countries or two separate nations, it might work. But you have that problem. The second challenge is the white people are fleeing. Now, the white people may have been oppressive and racist, but they had managerial and middle-class skills that were essential to the functioning of the economy, and now they're leaving. They left Kenya, they left Uganda, they're leaving. Who's going to take their place? What is the managerial replacement? You could say, well, they should have trained managers to be their replacement, native managers, but they didn't. The third was the economy. You now have an economy. In order to make that economy work, you have to improve the infrastructure, and you need to persuade outside powers to invest in your country. Oh. Would you invest? I mean, without investors, you're not going anywhere. Then you're going to fall back to what was. 4, you now have as the strongest force in your country, left by the colonial powers, the native police and the native army. And they've got guns. So, if you're having an argument between a disarmed intellectual and an armed policeman, I mean, you can see who's going to win this. I mean, that's what's happened in Africa. When the colonial powers left, the only people left with guns were those police and that army. And in fact, the history of black Africa since then has been the power and presence of the police and the army. Fourth was, of course, the inevitable corruption. As the economy did not improve, the people with guns then decided who was going to get what was. Well, I'll tell you what was. So, I now leave my house and my farm. I'm a white farmer and I've got a white house, got whatever. I now leave. So, there it is. Well, now General Ho-Ho, whatever his name is, all right, now moves in and what? Does he hand it to the peasants? No. He's a person of significance and importance, so that's his house. Isn't it his house? There is a palace for the governor. Oh, so now the head of the country is General so-and-so. Well, he needs room. So he moves into the palace. And having moved into the palace, he needs all the accoutrements that belong formally to the governor, if not more, to establish his power. You need money for uniforms, do you understand, for all the things that will give you the image of power. You have limited money. Would it be nice maybe to turn the palace into a school? Well, certainly, one of the major challenges was every one of these new governments was committed to an idea brought to them from Europe: democracy. But the problem was, democracy is not simply an idea. Democracy is supposed to be a reality. And as a reality, it rests on the existence of a large, well-educated middle class. And that didn't exist. So you can call everybody in the village together and give them a lecture. So the UN sends a lecturer. I'm going to give you a lecture on democracy. What you should now do is don't obey your chief in all things. Fire him if he's no good. I mean, what are you talking about? So the problem in Africa is that they embraced the idea of democracy before the economic realities were there. What happened in Europe was at first the realities emerged, and then what? The ideas emerged. In Africa first came the idea, and then you were supposed to invent the realities that were supposed to support it. So how do they cope with all this? Well, this is the coping strategy all the way up to 2002. Since you couldn't have democracy, and the only stabilizing force in the country where there was a lot of infighting and civil war was the military, most African countries ended up under the control of the military. The second coping strategy was, since you couldn't get any outside investment, you decided, we don't want outside investment. We want socialism, thank you. So now you create a socialist economy. They did that in Tanzania, they did that in Zambia. The issue about an economy, whether it's capitalistic, socialist, doesn't make any difference, is growth. If there's no growth, then I don't care what you call it. You're just, divvying up the small pie. And in fact, nobody could figure out how to make it grow because neither Tanzania nor Zambia had a supply of what we call entrepreneurial managers that might be able to do that. One of the coping styles was obviously, when people complained, to arrest them, throw them in jail or kill them. And repression is one of the major strategies for coping on the part of African regimes ever since the independence movement. It certainly was used by the colonial powers, but it was also used by them. One of the ways of coping was using the Cold War. Well, if you Americans don't approve of our socialist economy, we're going to Moscow. So what happened in Africa, certainly in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, was that African countries made a choice. One of the ways they got money, investment money, was they said to America, if you don't give us money, we're going to the Soviet Union. And they said to the Soviet Union, if you don't give us money, we're what? We're going to America. And in fact, that was a coping strategy. One of the major coping strategies in Africa, if you travel through Africa, is religion. Since the economy doesn't work, and you're living in poverty, what's your best strategy for coping? prayer. I mean, it's a major coping strategy. I mean, this has remained the most intensely religious part of the world. You're not going to find a more religious part of the world than you're going to find in Africa. Certainly, one of the ways to do it, if you can find the bank to do it, is to borrow. And in fact, one of the ways they coped was what? Borrow, 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 and when they couldn't pay back the debt, they would then what? Every few years you would hear they're renegotiating the debt for Tanzania, borrowing and renegotiation. Now, one of the ways to cope, using an old Tutsi term, which I've used before, is mazel. Mazel is luck. So no. Nigeria is an overpopulated country filled with 3 main nations who hate each other, 2 major religions that hate each other, the whole thing. But just as the British are leaving, they find oil. Huge reservoirs of oil. In fact, Nigeria is now one of the major suppliers of oil for the United States of America. They found the oil. And not only there, they also found it in Angola. Huge reservoirs of oil in Cabinda here. So Angola found, so now there's oil. Ooh. That's a good coping strategy. I keep checking my backyard all the time. I don't know. It's a coping strategy. And the last and very important is, and I'm sure there's justice to it, local politics was generally conducted by asking, why are we in such a deplorable condition? Answer, the West. They came, they conquered us, and they left us in this mess. Well, that's partially true. They certainly conquered you, and they certainly exploited you, but they certainly built schools and hospitals and cities and infrastructure. I mean, whatever. They didn't do enough. And in some cases, they did far too little. But the problem you have can't be solved by saying it's the West. Because given the existing structure of these countries, if you simply pour in Western money, there is no guarantee that the what? The countries will be rescued. Now, along the way, there developed what I call 4 styles of democracy. Now, everybody in any of these countries you go to uses the word democracy. I was in Togo a couple years ago. They have a dictator, Eyadema. His picture, when I went to the bathroom, it was like right over the toilet was I mean, no matter where you went, I knew whom not to denounce in public, under any circumstance. Everywhere, this is the Democratic Republic, do you understand, of Togo. Everything is democracy. Was the president elected? Was there an election? Of course there was an election. So everything in Africa is democratic with a small d. But it's also a dictatorship almost. And so let me give you the 4 styles. The 4 styles are the cult leader. That is a dictatorship where the dictator is viewed as the chief. Very African. The chief. Mobutu in the Congo or Zaire. That was the chief. Certainly that was part of Eyadema in Togo was the chief. The second kind is what I call majority dictatorship. That is where you have an unstable country with 2 or 3 nations within who are fighting each other. And so the nation that is the majority imposes its control through the army over the rest. And that was Nigeria for most of its history. In the north of Nigeria are the Muslims. The Muslims controlled the army, and the army imposed its rule on Nigeria. It's called majority dictatorship, and in fact the economy was fueled by money that came from petroleum. Well, then you have the third style, which is minority dictatorship. Minority dictatorship is what happened in Rwanda. In Rwanda, you have a small group of Tutsis who control the army, ruling over a large number of Hutus. Is it a dictatorship? Yes. Do they have formal elections? Yes. The Tutsis rule the Hutus. And that's the system. And that's how you get stability. Either the majority uses the army or the minority uses the army. And the fourth style is what we call the one-party system. Generally happened in those states that embrace socialism. One party with a party leader. Tanzania. It had a chief. It was chief for years. His name was Nyerere. They couldn't make the economy work. They finally got the Chinese to come in and to build them a railroad. But no matter what, he was the head of the one-party state. Kaunda in Zambia. Socialist Party, one-party state, and what? Kaunda, the leader. So in all cases, there is a repressive, dictatorial state. And in most African countries, nobody could figure out how to bring about any form of what we would call political democracy. The consequences of all these styles was economic decline. Today in the Congo, despite how bad the Belgians were, and they were terrible, the economic condition of most of the people in the Congo is worse than it was in 1960 when the Belgians left the Congo. The second is the Civil War. These states are unstable. Sometimes you get a dictatorship that can impose law and order, and sometimes you get a dictatorship that can't. In Rwanda, what happened? The majority rose up against the minority, and this terrible massacre occurred. The Congo is all divided up, made up of many, many nationalities, and no central government able to impose its control. The third consequence is, if nationalism isn't enough of a provocation, there's religion. This is an intensely religious continent. For almost everybody on this continent, their religion takes up a large part of their life. In Ghana, on a Sunday morning, everybody is in church. They even have a couple golf courses. There was nobody on the golf course. So in an intensely religious continent, if you've got Muslims up here and Christians over here, you're going to have what? Continuous confrontation all across the line. One of the consequences, certainly, is what I would call this hideous use of what I call pseudo-democratic vocabulary. It's just over and over and over again, used by the governments to justify their dictatorships, and all of it is aggravated by other things. One, the Sahara is growing in size, and the drought is increasing, expanding poverty. Urbanization, now that you've got cities, if you can't make any money down in the village, you pick yourself up and you move to the what? To the city, and now you live in these huge, enormous African slums in the cities where you have absolutely no support system whatsoever. Now, there exists in Africa an alternative. The alternative was the area of Africa which had a sufficiently large white population so that it ultimately resisted the resentments of the black majority. That's in what? Southern Africa. Enough white people came from Europe, enough European people, to provide what I would call a sufficiently large mass of people. And we're talking primarily about two countries here. One is South Africa, and the other is a country to the north of South Africa, which for a while was called Rhodesia, and today is called Zimbabwe. And in these two countries, there was a sufficiently large white population to offer resistance. So, now what's interesting about this alternative is that in these countries, while the overwhelming majority of the people who were black were disenfranchised, among the whites there was democracy. Do you understand? That is, the whites in South Africa conducted their own democracy, and the whites in Rhodesia conducted their own little democracy. In South Africa, there were 40 million people, 4 million of which, or 4.5 million of which were white. And in Rhodesia, there was somewhere around initially 7 million people, of whom 250,000 were white. The Rhodesian thing was maybe less stable than the South African thing, but there they were. And what they were able to do was that the white population produced a large, fairly well-educated middle class. All right? So although they excluded the blacks, they created something in South Africa that was a kind of caricature image of what existed in Europe, and there was a hope on the part of liberals. The hope on the part of liberals was that if you could only overthrow the apartheid regimes in these countries, the racist regimes, and if the whites would stay, you would have the foundation in Africa of countries that what? That worked in a Western style. Now Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia, its history was, it was seized by a corporation under the British, headed by Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodesia Company governed southern Rhodesia until 1924. And if the whites would stay, you would have the foundation in Africa of countries that what? That worked in a Western style. Now Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia, its history was, it was seized by a corporation under the British, headed by Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodesia Company governed southern Rhodesia until 1924. The corporation, like the British East India Company. And in 1924, the British took the rule away from them and established direct rule by the British government. During that time, they brought in thousands of white settlers, including Stuart Granger. No, you may no. Anybody wants to know a name of a settler who ended up in Rhodesia? It was Stuart Granger. Okay, so they came, they settled, and in fact, the land was given to the whites, who controlled most of the land, and they established these large plantation farms where they grew primarily wheat, and in particular, something I disapprove of, but they made a lot of money from it, tobacco. The area was very good for the growing of tobacco, and they made a lot of money from it, and very prosperous farms were established. And the economy worked very, very well, and then all hell broke loose. That is, all the black countries to the north are declaring their independence, and now they've reached the boundaries of Rhodesia. And at that time, a white political leader in 1965 by the name of Ian Smith, unilaterally against the opposition of the British government, declared Rhodesia to be an independent country. The British denounced the secession, but they weren't able to do anything about it, and now Rhodesia became this independent country and remained independent as a white-dominated country from 1965 to 1980. How was it able to do it? Well, very simple. It was protected by the larger neighbor to the south, namely South Africa, even though all kinds of sanctions were imposed against Rhodesia. But it was very clear after a while that the white minority was too small to control the black population. In time, terrible rebellions took place. There were massacres of white farmers, just like Kenya. The leader, the major leader of the opposition was an intellectual, a Marxist intellectual by the name of Robert Mugabe. He's still the leader. And in 1980, much to the chagrin of South Africa, Rhodesia surrendered itself to its black majority. Ian Smith resigned as the leader. Mugabe became now the president of the country. They couldn't use the name Rhodesia. Rhodesia was named after the what? The corporation leader Cecil Rhodes. I mean, please. It's now renamed by an African name, an empire that existed centuries before in the area named Zimbabwe, and the country is now called Zimbabwe. The capital city, which was Salisbury, its name is changed to Harare, which it is today. And now Mugabe takes over, and the whites are terrified. Is not Mugabe a Marxist? They're getting ready to leave. But then something happens which creates great hope. Mugabe says, there are Marxists and there are what? And there are Marxists. Already Deng Xiaoping in China is proving that you can be a Marxist and a capitalist simultaneously. So he says, no, 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 no to the whites. We need your managerial skills. We want you to stay. Keep your farms. It's a friendly government. And in fact, through the 1980s, over one half of all the white states, some of them just didn't want to, they were afraid to stay, but over one half stayed. And in fact, continued to manage the farm economy. So now you had a black-dominated country where 70 to 75% of the land was controlled by the whites. But the economy is growing. And in fact, between 1980 and 1990, Zimbabwe, I was there, Zimbabwe is booming. In fact, tourists are arriving right and left. Everybody wants to go to the Niagara Falls of Africa. It's called Victoria Falls, and they're all coming in, and everything is booming. And now there is the hope that somehow or other, this is a sign that you can have a dynamic economy and a democracy, because after all, Mugabe was elected by the overwhelming majority of the people who were black to be the president of the country, and he isn't driving out the whites. He is what? accommodating them and whatever. So, for many, many liberals, they said, you see, maybe this is the beginning. Zimbabwe is an example of an African country that can develop a modern economy and a democratic government. And that can happen when you have the what? The mix between the whites and the blacks together, cooperate. Ooh. And then in South Africa, well, South Africa held out to the end. It was able to hold out because the United States of America also offered it its protection. South Africa was viewed as a major opponent of the Soviet Union. And in fact, the United States of America was not prepared to see the government in South Africa overthrown, but then that became irrelevant. Once the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, it was all up for grabs. The United States of America now said, certainly appealing to the large non-white population of voters in the United States of America, the government has to reform. The net result is the apartheid regime in South Africa fell. The leader of the black resistance, Nelson Mandela, is released. A new constitution is written. An election is held. And now, just like Mugabe in Zimbabwe, what? Mandela is elected. And now the question is, whites, 4.5 million whites, do we stay or do we leave? Now, if you're white and in South Africa and have been there for a long time, staying would be really desirable. I mean, it's a great life. Servants, wealth, prosperity, gorgeous scenery, beaches, whatever. Who'd want to leave? But we can't stay if now this angry resistance movement is going to drive us out. So in walks Mandela, one of the great leaders of modern times. And he says, and he's much more graceful than Mugabe, he said, relax. This country isn't just for blacks, it's also for what? It's also for whites. This is a black-white country. We can all live together. It is true that the overwhelming majority of the people in this country are black, but we can live together. We need the skills of the white minority, and we hope that they will stay. And you remember the euphoria that existed at the beginning of the 1990s. Liberals were saying, finally apartheid is gone, and now we may have the foundation of something. Because South Africa has the economic power, given its European roots, has the economic power to change the economy of Africa. Well, by 1995, the hopes were very high. In fact, what was happening by 1995 is that now, since South Africa wasn't being boycotted, South African corporations were beginning to expand their operations into Central Africa, opening up plants, sending corporate officials, looking for markets, whatever, and stimulating the economy, providing what we would call an African source for the development of something new, and also for the foundation of what we would call a political democracy, because you need to create some kind of a middle class. And then the axe fell. The axe fell when in 1995 and 1996, Robert Mugabe, the leader in Zimbabwe, changed his mind. He decided, basically, to drive the whites out of Zimbabwe. Now, that's a reversal of the decision that was made in 1980, on which the foundation of whatever prosperity there was in Zimbabwe rested. He made that decision, and that decision has now wrought havoc all over southern Africa, with a chance that the one base or foundation which can at least ensure that Africa might have access to the new economy is being undermined. Now, the overthrow of the white regimes in Zimbabwe and South Africa led to the emergence of new black regimes. In Zimbabwe, the ruler has remained the president, who is the head of the leading party, the National Union Party. ZANU is Robert Mugabe. And in South Africa, it was, for most of the time, Nelson Mandela, but he retired a few years ago, and he was replaced by his chief lieutenant, whose name is Mbeki, M-B-E-K-I, and he doesn't have the charisma of Mandela, but then not many people, in the world, not many politicians have Mandela's charisma. Okay. And from the beginning, despite making the statement that we wish to preserve our white minorities, they are essential to the development of what we call both a decent economy and political democracy. They confronted some serious problems that are there. The first, and anybody who goes to South Africa or Zimbabwe can see it, the dichotomy between the lifestyle of the whites and the blacks. It's just overwhelming. There are blacks who've made it, but the overwhelming majority of the blacks still live in poverty. For the white people in South Africa, other than having to defend themselves against crime, their prosperous lifestyle has not changed. And one of the reasons they were motivated to stay was because they would never be able to duplicate that lifestyle anywhere that they could possibly go. Even if they could take out all their money and end up in Southern California. Go find servants in, well, fortunately you have the Chicanos coming across the border, right? But I mean, the lifestyle is incomparable. So, and there it is. And if you go to Cape Town or Joburg now, the whites will always be complaining. But indeed, they still live very prosperously. And if you would go down to parts of Soweto and to many of the areas where Africans still live, and now segregation is illegal. But segregation is effective simply because of economic reasons. The people with the overwhelming wealth are the whites. And in Rhodesia, that's true. It is true that the generals and leaders of Robert Mugabe's party have very nice houses. But the overwhelming majority of blacks in Zimbabwe are on what we would call, or at, the poverty level. For the whites that remain, and before Mugabe changed his mind, there were somewhere around 110,000 whites that remained out of 250,000 in Zimbabwe. Their lifestyle was pretty fantastic. All right. If they were the masters of large farms, they may have worked hard as managers, but their lifestyle was such that in the end they were overwhelmingly segregated from the black population. The second is that with the increase in population, which keeps growing, there's this hunger for land. These people are essentially farmers. Should they be middle class? Yes. Should they be pursuing BAs and MAs and PhDs? Yes. Yes. Are they? No. What they know how to do are basic farm skills. And what they want is land, and most of the good land is in the hands of the white farms and the white farmers where it may be efficiently managed, but for them, they're basically workers on these farms, often paid very, very low wages. I mean, one of the reasons why the farming in Zimbabwe is so successful is because the labor is so cheap. The third is that within these countries, there are all these internal tribal and national conflicts. For instance, in Zimbabwe, when I was there, it was very clear there were two nations living in that country other than the whites. The largest nation, which was somewhere around 70% of the population, called the Shona. And their center is Harare, that's the national capital. Mugabe is Shona. And the ZANU party, his party is Shona. The competing one was a break-off from the Zulus called the Ndebele. And they're centered mainly in the southern part of Zimbabwe. Their main city is Bulawayo. And the Shonas hate the Ndebeles, and the Ndebeles hate the Shonas. I mean, they've been fighting each other. Before the British came, they were killing each other. In fact, in the middle of the 19th century, it was the break-off from the Zulus that was in charge. And the Shonas were the victims. And now the Shonas are the majority. It's a democracy, right? They got the vote. So they gave it to the Ndebeles. I mean, they like removed them from all. You don't have any famous general from any of them, or bureaucrat, or leader. They're all Shona. So you can imagine the resentment that exists in the Ndebele territory. And that has nothing to do with the white presence. It's a continuous problem. And in South Africa, you've got the Zulus over here in the east. You've got the Xhosas here in the southeast. You've got the Sutus to the north of them, and historically, and then the Tswanas north of them, and they don't get along. And somehow practicing, you don't think of practicing affirmative action within the black community, but you have to practice affirmative action. So many Zulus, so many Xhosas, so many Sutus, in order to keep things going. In Zimbabwe, the hatred was so intense, they simply excluded one whole group. One of the problems, obviously, is when you live in an agricultural world with no radio and no TV and no awareness of the outside world, if you live at a survival level, you are accustomed to that suffering. But once you live on a poverty level in a world in which you can turn on TV and you can see how what? The prosperous people of the world are living, then your expectation level rises. Where you are is now absolutely and totally unacceptable and unsatisfactory. I mean, it happens to me all the time. I turn on TV and I realize there are many things in my life I don't have that I need right away. I thought I was happy. So you have all these people at poverty level, but they're in a technological culture where expectations are on a continuous level being stimulated. And then one of the things that triggered Mugabe's decision was the falling price of tobacco on the world market. Am I responsible partly for the falling price of tobacco on the world market? I have been denouncing it for years. Now I feel guilty. I mean, am I responsible for this crisis in Zimbabwe? I mean, I don't know. But there were the falling price of tobacco on the world market, which reduced government revenue and which now resulted also in farm unemployment. And so now the demand for the government to do something, when the economy was prosperous, then it was fine. People seemed to accept it. But now, with growing unemployment and the decline in the economy, Mugabe had to respond. One of the major issues is crime. Now, the major victims of crime in South Africa and Zimbabwe are blacks. Same thing as in Detroit, right? They live right in the middle of it. Their children are always getting shot. But if you ever go to South Africa, like today, I mean, white people cannot stop talking about the crime. There's no point in having all this money and whatever else it is if you're going to be a prisoner in your house. Can't move. All this poverty and this high level of expectation and the freedoms of a democratic society encourage what we have also in North America, but in this case it's far worse because the levels of poverty percentage-wise are far, far greater. And the dichotomy is so great. So one of the great challenges is crime. One of the reasons why white people might choose to leave is not because they're not making money. It's because they don't want to live in the midst of this crime. And one of the reasons why the African population might be annoyed is not only economic, it's that they're living, I mean, they can't even live peacefully in poverty. One of the worst provocations is the arrival of a disease. Did it have its origins in Africa? That's always the big debate. All right, fine. Is it a conspiracy on the part of the West to infect African people? It's the AIDS epidemic. And the AIDS epidemic is most severe in southern Africa. Why? By the way, it's very severe. It is least severe in West Africa. Although now in the Ivory Coast, the percentage of AIDS infection is almost up to 10% of the population. Its strongest areas are along the East Coast and in the South. Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania, very high. It is presumed that in places like Uganda and Kenya, it may be up between 15 to 20% of the population may be infected, and the same thing may be true of Tanzania. And the same thing is true of Zambia and even more so of Malawi. But in Zimbabwe and South Africa, it's higher. And the reason is, now that the borders of South Africa are open, thousands and thousands and thousands of poor blacks all the way from here, do you understand? Have poured in as cheap labor, often illegally, into South Africa. They're not living with family. They're not staying in their villages. They're what? Everybody's on the move, and now because you have a dynamic economy, you have truck drivers. Everybody's on the move. And when everybody's on the move, diseases will spread more around. If everybody sort of stayed in his home village, then the spread of the disease would be controlled. But now they're what? They're all on the move, and the net result is actually the highest rate of infection, which may be close to 30% of the population, is Botswana, an old British protectorate that lies between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And then Zimbabwe and South Africa most likely have 25% of their population infected. 25% and rising. Do you understand what a health disaster, I mean, talk about poverty. That means that 1/4 of your population is unable to function even economically, let alone dying. So let's look at how these countries have responded. South Africa's response is rather interesting. One of the controversial things that the president of South Africa, Mbeki, is to deny that there is an AIDS epidemic. I mean, the reason for it is very clear. This is African pride. That is, things like this do not happen in Africa. I mean, there are all kinds of people in South Africa who are embarrassed. In fact, the pressures on him have been so great that he's backtracked recently. But the act of the denial has been that the government hasn't even responded adequately to this. This has nothing to do with the economic decline. It's the dying population. One of the things that's happened is the rise of political radicalism. There are new parties emerging in South Africa, and old parties being revived that are now saying, why should we leave all this wealth in the hands of the whites? It's not fair. This is a black country. Let's take it away and redistribute it. And there are lots of people in the midst of the crisis of poverty and AIDS who, I mean, they endorse it. I mean, Mandela's former wife was one of the radicals that emerged, the more radical voice. One of the results, of course, is the decline in the influence and power of the ruling political party, which is the African National Congress, of which Mandela was the leader. Because now many people say in the black community, the ANC is a sellout. They're stooges for the whites. One of the things that's happening in South Africa, one of the responses, is that white people are leaving. That is, between the climate of crime and economic uncertainty and rising political radicalism, they're not sure they want to remain. The difficulty is that for many of the white people, they cannot take most of their money out of the country with them, unless they were extremely clever a long time ago and deposited it in, appropriate Swiss bank accounts or sneaked the whole thing out of the country. It's not easy to leave. For business people, it's very hard. For professionals, it's easier because they can take their skills with them. So, but there is an increasing white flight. The first thing you do is, if you live in Johannesburg, you move to Cape Town. And then, finally, you have to tear yourself away from that beautiful city. You finally pick yourself up and fly out of Cape Town. One of the responses is that the euphoria that existed after Mandela came to power has now been replaced by a kind of malaise. The country isn't quite sure where to go. And that's reinforced by the ambivalence of the government. Mbeki would like to satisfy the radical elements in his own party and the demands being made from the poor all over South Africa for some redistribution of wealth, but he knows that if he starts that, the whites will simply leave in toto. So everything sort of hangs in the balance. And he's influenced by what has happened in Zimbabwe. So now let me turn to Robert Mugabe. With the falling price of tobacco and with the increasing demand of the people for land, Mugabe decided to deal with the issue of economic decline by finding a scapegoat. He said, The reason why we have this economic decline is because the overwhelming majority of the wealth in this country is in the hands still, 20 years after independence, still in the hands of whites. And it is they who are responsible for our economic decline, which is the reverse of what was maintained in 1980. So if they're responsible for the economic decline, then what needs to happen is to remove the wealth they have from them and redistribute it. To reinforce that, his political party has organized a militia. They're pretty tough guys. When I was in Zimbabwe, they were just beginning. He didn't quite know what to do with them. One of them bumped into me, actually, in Harare. And so my initial inclination was to go after him and tell him off. And then I said, Sherwin, relax. Relax. But now they're a pretty tough crowd. They're mainly composed either of veterans of the war back in 1980s, most of whom are too old to serve in this force, or their children or their grandchildren, or whatever else it is. They're toughs. The leader is a doctor, a physician, Hunzi, who was trained as a physician in communist Poland, came back to Zimbabwe. His favorite political hero is Adolf Hitler, believe it. That's a black. I mean, you gotta be out of your mind. They've explained to him, do you understand that if you went to visit Hitler, he would kill you? Whatever. That's his political role model, and is he slightly demented? Maybe not. He's certainly politically clever. And now these thugs are around to intimidate whatever political opposition there is. And they're very useful, and they're also there to encourage land-hungry people to occupy white farms. And going back to 1999, early 2000 or 2000, Mugabe gave the signal for supposed veterans of the war against the whites in the Civil War to seize certain farms. They just moved on the farms, and the white farmers couldn't resist them, and if they wanted to offer resistance, the militia was there to support them. So they moved in and they laid claim to the land, which means that the farms became totally dysfunctional. Because now, I mean, there's no point in growing anything on a farm unless you can distribute it. So the whole system of distribution has broken down. They're just on the land. And Hunzi is saying, yes, and Mugabe, that's right. Well, now the white farmers are terrified. And the second step after the third after the militia and the seizure is change the Constitution. The Constitution would empower the president, almost by decree, to take away land that was inappropriately owned. Well, that scared a lot of people. That certainly scared the white farmers. But it also frightened many of the people in Zimbabwe, the blacks. He already had an opposition around Bulawayo in the north with the Ndebele, right? The people who didn't like the Shona. And plus, among the Shona, there were many educated blacks, even ordinary workers, who could see the economy was going down the drain, and the reason it was going down the drain was not the fault of white ownership. They found a leader called the Movement for Democracy. The leader's name is Tsvangirai, and certainly receiving help from the white farmers, there's no doubt about it. A rather powerful political movement arose, and in the year 2000, the new constitution which Mugabe proposed was rejected at the polls. and some 57 out of 120 people in the parliament now belong to the opposition party. Mugabe is what? Beside himself with anger. So now what he does is he increases the power of the militia, and now when the opposition party meets, thugs show up. Break up the meetings. Tsvangirai is arrested. He is accused of plotting against the life of the president. And more seizures take place. Well, in March, an election is to be held. An election again for the parliament. And Mugabe is now afraid that if this election is held freely, he will not make it. And so it's very clear what he does. He brings out his thugs and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Zimbabwe, mainly black, were unable to vote. Now there are complaints coming from all over the world. The complaints are coming from Europe that now declares sanctions against Mugabe. Unless you change what you're doing, we're not going to what? Trade with you, which certainly doesn't help the economy. And that's the whole point. Maybe to force his resignation or to force him to change his behavior. And then protests occur in the British Commonwealth, of which Zimbabwe is a member because it's a former British colony, protesting. And then all of these protesters now turn on the leaders of the African countries. And they ask them to denounce Mugabe, especially Mbeki of South Africa. What is interesting is they chastise him, but they refuse to exclude and to isolate him. Why? Well, this is African pride. They're not going to be told by a bunch of Europeans how to run things, and in fact, most African rulers themselves feel vulnerable. They run their countries in a dictatorial fashion if they challenge the dictatorship of Mugabe. But Mbeki runs a democracy. Why is he afraid? Well, in March, the election was held, and obviously Mugabe slips through as the victor. The opposition refuses to accept the legitimacy of the election. Sanctions are now imposed by countries all over the world. The economic position of Zimbabwe declines. More and more whites are trying to sell. How can you sell? And leave. And now that's the signal to the whites in South Africa. If this is happening in Zimbabwe, maybe we're only what? 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years away in South Africa from the same thing happening in South Africa. Maybe I need to pack up and leave. And if the whites leave Zimbabwe and South Africa totally, then what you have is the same foundation as you have up here in Kenya or Tanzania. It's a critical time, and I want to conclude by simply saying, one of the most important things that needs to be done by the African world, supported by the European and North American powers, is to remove Robert Mugabe from power. Either do that by arranging a coup, either do that by applying such sanctions that the people themselves rise up in economic distress against him. But this man, he's now 78 years old, been in power for 22 years, is the ruin not only of Zimbabwe and the ultimate ruin not only maybe of South Africa, but a threat to whatever possibilities there are for economic revival and democracy in Africa. And if I knew right now at this moment how to do it, I would do it, but I don't. I'm just simply saying to you, removing Mugabe from power is essential to saving the remnants of whatever can be saved for the future of African democracy and political and economic viability. And I leave you with that challenge, and as you walk out, if you can figure out a way, please call me. Thank you very, very much.